Hello, darling. It's me, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, the sassy lassie with the classy chassis.
Hi, listeners! This is the 71st episode of the Bangers and Mash Show. I'm Mr. Bangers, aka Zach. My buddy, my pal, your friend and mine right over here is...
Mr. Mash, aka JD.
Yeah, and what are we talking about today, Mr. Mash?
Our favorite horror host.
Yes, this is a very spooky episode.
It is a very spooky episode indeed.
Watch out for booligans.
Watch out for booligans. I thought we called them ghouligans.
Ghouligans, that's good too. I don't know if they have this tradition overseas, but here in America, there's this idea of the horror host. This started back in the 50s when television first entered homes, and there wasn't a lot of programming that existed yet. There was a lot of old films on television. Universal partnered with another studio, MGM I think, and created this package of films that they called Jock. It was a collection of their old monster movies from the 30s and 40s and 50s. They syndicated this to local networks, and a lot of networks would show these movies, usually on the weekends, on Friday nights or Saturday mornings, sometimes after school. Children were the primary market at the time. And a lot of local networks would cook up characters to introduce the show, to host the show. That is the origin of the horror host. There have been many of them over the years, hundreds of them, and not all of them have followings. I'm sure there are lots of local ones that disappeared, but there are a few that became really popular. For a long time, the horror host thing went away. By the early 2000s, it had completely died out.
Yeah.
Throughout the 90s, there were a couple of stragglers and hangers-ons. You could find the old monster movies on TV around Halloween sometimes. In the last 5 or 10 years, you have seen something of a resurgence in interest of the horror host.
I think a lot of it is you have the kids that grew up watching the horror host back in the 80s and 90s and earlier, but now they're growing up, they want to bring it back because they remember how awesome it was.
The internet has made the revival of the horror host thing much more viable. But now you don't need a network. Lots of people just put on some goofy makeup or a costume or whatever, create a character and film something, and then they usually show some public domain horror movies. I don't know how many horror hosts have talked over The Killer Shrews and Night of the Living Dead and things like that. Because it's been popular on the internet, it's starting to creep back onto network. A lot of people who have been doing it for a long time have come back.
Count Cordoval.
Count Cordoval is back. Svengoolie is syndicated again. Elvira's doing more stuff. I'm hoping Joe Bob comes back soon as well. It seems like it's time. What's the whole appeal of the horror host thing? Why do we like it so much?
They give their own opinion of the horror movie, kind of razz on it.
Usually.
Especially if the movie they're showing isn't very good. Or as Mr. Lobo says, misunderstood.
Yeah, that's right.
They tend to take it and make it enjoyable.
Yeah, there's always a lot of jokes and jabbing at the expense of the movie.
Joe Bob Briggs would give trivia.
Yeah, a lot of them do that, and then a lot of them do skits. The corny joke is almost a tradition of the horror host.
Really part of the appeal. You can see they would watch it just for the horror host.
Frequently, the movie is not part of the appeal.
Who watched Elvira,
Yeah.
Mono's Hands of Fate?
Yeah, who watched Elvira for the movie? I don't think anybody was watching for the movie. The corniness is part of the appeal. Not all of them, but a lot of them are dressed up as a vampire or a mortician, and the jokes are usually sort of lame, but it's part of the appeal. They talk directly to the screen.
Yes.
It's like they're talking to you. It's not like you're watching TV, it's more like you're hanging out with a friend while you're watching a movie. That is a big part of why people have such a strong nostalgia for the whole concept of the horror host. We should get to our list of horror hosts we have here.
Hello, darling. It's me, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, the couch potato's favorite tomato. And I'm ripe and ready for a good time. And believe me, as soon as this movie's over, I'm gonna go out and have one.
Who's the most famous horror host? Who's the one that everybody thinks of immediately?
Elvira.
Yeah, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. She started in 1981. That's when she took over Movie Macabre, which was a horror program at a local Los Angeles station. And the guy who had been hosting the show had passed away. So they had an open call for a new host, and they wanted a female host. Cassandra Peterson, who was an actress and a singer and a showgirl, and had been in the business for a while. She dated Elvis for a brief period of time. Did you know that?
No.
She's led a pretty fascinating life, truthfully. Her and a friend came up with this character of Elvira. How would you describe Elvira's personality?
She put the ass in Raz. I mean,
Her personality, not her appearance.
She's very sarcastic. She loves to make fun of the movies.
And there's always a lot of puns at the expense of the film, the expense of the audience, and herself.
Yeah, she makes fun of everybody. It's not...
She looks like a goth or a vampire or something, but she acts like bubble brain valley girl. The main reason that Elvira became very, very popular, I don't think anybody...
Would be her attributes?
Yes, her dress is very low cut.
And she's endowed.
She's always been a very attractive woman. She's still very attractive, even though she's in her 60s now. But especially back in the early 80s when she first started doing the character and doing the show. And as I said earlier, I don't think very many people are watching Movie Macabre for the movies. You brought over some DVDs. They've released a couple of the original Movie Macabre episodes, and most of those movies aren't good. There's actually on Wikipedia a complete list of all the movies they showed on Elvira's Movie Macabre. So if you really want to go that deep, I'm sure there are some good ones in there. I know she showed Frankenstein at least once. The original Frankenstein.
Okay.
But most of the movies are bad. People were mostly watching for her. I think at least half, if not more, of Elvira's audience were late-night masturbators.
Well, that was the closest thing to free porn they had back in the 80s.
And there's no doubt she was a sex symbol. I don't want to spend too much time talking about how attractive she is, because let's face it, there are enough perverts on the internet.
That is part of her appeal, but
yeah.
Yes, she looks beautiful and she's gorgeous. What really brings me in is the jokes, the puns, the personality.
If Cassandra Peterson had been born a couple decades earlier, she would be in vaudeville. She has kind of a Mae West quality to her. She did Movie Macabre from 1981 to 1986. A series of VHS releases called Thriller Video, and that was in 1985. That was the only way to see episodes of the British TV series Hammer's House of Horror for a long time, was with the Elvira opening sequences.
Okay.
And the character was so popular. She wasn't just on television posting movies, she was the spokesperson for Coors beer. That was a very prominent, popular ad campaign.
Yes, I actually remember that.
Yeah, I do as well. Definitely remember seeing the cardboard standees of her in the grocery stores around Halloween
I
time.
seem to remember like a commercial from back in the day.
She was associated with that company for quite some time. I don't know how long exactly, but I definitely remember seeing stuff related to that. As a kid, I didn't really know what the horror host thing was. We didn't have it in this area. The concept of the local horror host was really on its way out. I just remember thinking of Elvira as this all-purpose multimedia personality. By the time we were kids, she had been in a movie. The character was popular enough that she managed to make a film.
God, that movie.
Elvira, Mistress of the Dark from 1988. It's a hoot.
Oh yeah, I love it.
It's a really goofy movie.
You can't watch this movie expecting fine cinema.
It's very silly. She has the poodle with the mohawk.
Gonk.
What's his name?
Gonk.
Gonk.
Short for Algonquin.
Okay, and I remember she makes a monster and a stew pot.
Yes.
Because there's some plot about witches. There's a magical ring, I believe. The joke is Elvira moves from L.A. to this very cloistered, puritanical...
It's actually Salem.
Is it Salem?
It's not Salem per se.
It's in Massachusetts.
It's in Massachusetts, and it's close enough to Salem.
Okay.
They have laws where they burn the witch at the stake.
Okay. That's the whole joke. Wild, crazy Elvira coming to this very sheltered, puritanical community and shaking things up.
So let's talk about some of the puns in this. The name of the woman, Charity Pariah.
Charity Pariah. The one joke that I always really remember, and I think this is a good example of her and the character's wit. She gets hit on the head.
Yes.
And somebody says, "How's your head?" And she says,
I've never had any complaints.
"Never had any complaints. Don't remember me as just a great pair of legs."
No, don't remember me as just a great pair of boobs.
Okay. Remember me as a great pair of legs, too.
If you only can remember me by 2 words, remember 2 words, just any two.
Any two, right. So the humor is not sophisticated in the film.
And when she gets in the bar fight and she pulls out her dagger,
Yes.
she's like, "I cut you, babe."
One of the reasons why the character is such a sex symbol is she's shameless about it. She has no
Yes.
problem. There are some shots in that movie that are so blatantly leering. I believe she's eating a hot dog.
Yes, and the hot dog falls down into her
The cleavage.
cleavage.
There's another scene where she's bending over and full-blown shot on her ass.
The one scene where she's wiping off the window in the car, and she
Right.
keeps pressing her boobs against the window.
Yeah, she's pretty willing to acknowledge that, but it's fun. They made sort of a sequel, which I've never seen. Elvira's Haunted Hills, which is a pun. That came out in 2001. She independently produced. She's talked a bit about how the first film didn't do as well as she thought it could have because it was controlled by another studio. She was going to make her own movie completely independently. And apparently it was quite an ordeal. I believe the movie was shot in some weird Eastern European country, someplace where it's really cheap to shoot. And I've never seen Haunted Hills. Is it any good?
To me, it's not as good as Mistress of the Dark. It's kind of too Elvira, almost.
Is it just a little too sticky?
Yeah.
Richard O'Brien from Rocky Horror Picture Show's in it.
Yes, it's a funny film.
For a while, it seemed like she went away. She wasn't as in the public eye as much, but there were a few things. There was a reality show in 2007 called The Search for the Next Elvira. This was on Fox Reality Channel, which I don't think even exists anymore. And I do remember seeing a couple episodes, because I remember, first off, there was I guess you would call them a female impersonator, was one of the contestants. There was one episode where Kane Hodder was a guest host. I believe she won. It was this really, really hot Asian woman. This is one of the would-be Elviras. But then Movie Macabre came back in 2010. She did a new series called Elvira's Movie Macabre, and this was nationally syndicated. I never saw it in our area.
Was it?
Yeah, it was on TV. And that is also on DVD. I watched some of those. The film package program that made the horror host thing possible in the 70s and 80s no longer exists. So she was just talking about public domain movies, The Killer Shrews and Manos, Hands of Fate and Bucket of Blood. I gotta tell you, I think she still looks incredible. The character is experiencing something of a revival in popularity. She was on Hulu last year doing something called 13 Nights of Elvira, where she hosted a bunch of full moon movies, which seems about right. Something that's interesting, I didn't get a chance to see this, but there was a TV pilot. She put together a pilot for a television show, really well received by the network, until the head of the network, the guy that gets to veto stuff, came in and said, we can't show that much cleavage on TV, and canned the entire program. Sandra Peterson has said she thinks Sabrina the Teenage Witch ripped them off, because apparently there's a talking cat in both shows.
I don't remember there being a talking cat in the pilot.
This is on YouTube. You can find it pretty easily.
From what I saw of the pilot, it looked really good. Almost like a remake of the Mistress of the Dark movie.
Okay. There were video games, 2 pinball machines. I know.
Wait, there was Elvira video games?
Yeah, there were computer games. Nothing on a console. Like first-person horror games, which were apparently very gory for their time. You weren't playing as Elvira, you were trying to rescue her. It was kind of like a first-person puzzle game sort of thing.
Oh, well, fuck that.
The one pinball machine was called Scared Stiff. They were comic books. DC has a long-running horror anthology comic called House of Mystery, and for a while it was Elvira's House of Mystery. She's even recorded a couple albums.
There's the Elvira rap.
I thought it was the Monster rap.
Or it might have been the Monster rap.
Yeah.
Well, it's great for what it is.
It's like everything with this character. It's goofy and silly and slightly naughty, but all in good fun. She's the queen of Halloween, and have no doubt that Elvira helped many men through puberty.
And now, MonsterVision host Joe Bob Briggs and Friday the 13th, Part 6 on TNT.
14 dead bodies, 1 dead, undead body, no breasts, 14 gallons of blood, corpse staking, teen shish kebabbing, 2 motor vehicle chases, 1 with crash and burn, knife through the head ripping, gratuitous Boy Scout lesson, lightning foo, whiskey bottle foo, 3 stars, check it out.
In the early 90s, when cable was still a relatively new thing, it was like how early television stations were. There was a lot of time to fill and not a lot of programming, so a lot of channels showed movies. The things that were easy and cheap to acquire were horror movies, and some of them would bring in personalities to host them. One that you were a big fan of was Mr. Joseph Biggers.
Yeah, or Joe Bob Briggs.
Joe Bob Briggs. Do you know the name of the actual guy who plays Joe Bob? Joe Bob's a character, of course.
No.
It's Joseph Bloom, and he's talked about the origins of Joe Bob. He was working in Texas, was a film reviewer for a newspaper or a magazine or something. He would go see the big budget studio films, and he wasn't really that interested in them. And the stuff he liked were the weird, low-budget movies. And he decided to invent this character, Joe Bob Briggs, who is a good old boy, redneck, has various wisdoms and adventures in his life related to his rural, white upbringing. The column was in the back of the newspaper where nobody would read it, but it caught on and became popular. His first gig was hosting drive-in theater on the Movie Channel. He hosted that from 1986 to 1996. And that was where Joe Bob came to be. And you want to talk about his style.
I like to give trivia. He does the Elvira thing where he razzes on the movie.
He does.
But he also gives you useful information.
The drive-in totals is what he's most famous for.
Yeah.
He has this weird way of speaking in a film where somebody picks up a random object and uses it to defend themselves. Say it's a shovel. He will say that shovel foo.
Something foo.
Yeah. And when 2 characters are, doing it, he calls that aardvarking.
Aardvarking, yeah. I remember the aardvarking.
And he talks about how many decapitated heads, how many breasts there are in the movie.
Didn't he do how many gallons of blood were spilled or something?
He would mention that from time to time. Something that gave a little novelty to the Joe Bob thing is that he wasn't like a lot of other horror hosts who did the corny vampire or guy in a top hat sort of
he
thing.
was a redneck or cattle hand. Cowboy. He was like an old western cowboy.
Yeah.
He was different. I think that's why he always stuck out to me.
But I don't think drive-in theater is the version that we really remember. I don't know about you, but I didn't have the Movie Channel in the early 90s.
Well, I did.
Where Joe Bob really caught on with us. Right after his Movie Channel show got canceled, he went over to TBS, the Turner Broadcasting Station, which was, again, looking for programming, and he started a show called MonsterVision. and that's the one that we really remember.
Yes.
I remember that opening with the neon... I goes, TNT or TBS?
I thought it was TNT.
Maybe it was TNT, the Turner Network Television.
Yeah.
Ted Turner has so many fucking channels, it's hard to keep track. But I remember the green flashing light, tubes were some sort of glowing liquid electrodes with lightning going across them, and then we would cut to Joe Bob in his trailer, usually.
Yes.
So they did do skits. One year for Halloween, they showed a bunch of movies. They did the Nair Witch Project, where him and the mailbag, they had to have a little sex appeal with their horror hosting, so Joe Bob would have his mail girls, who would come in usually Daisy Dukes and a tied-off t-shirt, to answer the letters from the weirdos and the perverts that watched the show. Reading an interview with Elvira, or with Cassandra Peterson, they talked about her fan base, and she said she got a lot of letters from men in prison.
Tell the story about the guy with the standing...
God. Okay, in the 80s, my uncle worked as a security guard in a liquor store. One day he came in, the store had been broken into. No money had been stolen. The only thing that had been stolen was a six-pack of beer and the Elvira standee cutout.
A certain little piece of cardboard got violated.
I mean, don't know what happened to the cardboard? That's a pretty great story. MonsterVision, I remember watching it occasionally, and I think you watched it pretty frequently. It ran from 96 to 2000.
I think I watched probably 4 years of that.
It was on Saturday nights, wasn't it?
Friday nights.
Friday nights. These horror host shows are usually on the weekends, but the thought process being, nobody's going to be home on Friday night watching, so we'll just show whatever. And I do remember a lot of jokes about Ted Turner and his wife, Jane Fonda. It was all in good fun, and then MonsterVision got canceled because TNT stopped being cool. Joe Bob, he's still out there. He's got a website. He updates frequently. They did a couple DVDs where he would do commentaries of the film. They need to get Joe Bob on Netflix or something like that.
Somebody with Netflix money can do a horror host with real movies that aren't public domain.
Because Netflix has so many crappy, low-budget horror movies on their channel anyway. It seems like a natural place for it.
Yes.
We were talking the other day, how come there's never been a Joe Bob movie? You and I were brainstorming ideas for a Joe Bob movie.
He's a master of something food.
Our thoughts is he's hosting some sort of event at a drive-in, and then the zombie apocalypse broke out. That was the idea we came up with in like 10 seconds.
It writes itself.
Yeah, it really does. If we ever see John Bloom at a convention or anything, we definitely need to pitch him Joe Bob versus the apocalypse or whatever.
What I need is a vampire cocktail to settle my nerves. It'll not only settle them, it will petrify.
Now let's talk about some of the other horror hosts that have been out. Some of these we've watched and we know, and other of these were before our time, but I just want to talk about them a little bit. You know who the first horror host was?
Vampira?
Vampira.
Are you sure it was Vampira?
I looked. The internet says that Vampira was the first horror host, and that surprised me. Her show started in 1954. The Vampira show ran from 54 to 55, and then she did a couple other things here and there. The name of the woman, Malaya Nurmi or something, in the 80s, that person took Elvira to court, claimed that she stole her act, which is debatable. I don't think you can copyright spooky, vaguely vampiric goth chick in a low-cut black dress. Both admit that they ripped off Morticia Addams. Unfortunately, not very many clips from the original Vampira show survive today. There weren't any VCRs in 1954. Vampira's enduring legacy is Plan 9 from Outer Space, the infamous Edward D. Wood Jr. film from 1958. Long considered the worst movie ever made, but it's not. Really, it's not. There are way worse films. As inept as the production values on Plan 9 from Outer Space are, that movie is still incredibly entertaining. And infamously, at least according to the Tim Burton movie Ed Wood, Vampira didn't want any dialogue. She didn't want to be associated with the horror genre anymore. So it's just her standing out in a fake graveyard doing this with her hands. And another one that's really famous from that early era, probably best known as Zacherly. John Zacherly is the guy's actual name. He started in 1957 with a program called Shock Theater.
Shock Theater.
Yeah, Shock Theater was used as a name for a bunch of these local horror host programs. And he started as Rollin', and this was out of Philadelphia.
Did he keep rolling?
He got most famous in New York, where he also hosted a program called Shock Theater from 58 to 59. That was when he was first called Zacherly, the cool ghoul. That was one of the first persons to do the corpse paint in the suit with a candelabra and crack corny jokes. And again, because this was such an old program, there is not a lot of footage of the original Shock Theater. I do remember seeing a VHS called Horrible Horrors with Zacherly.
Horrible horror.
Yeah, him in a haunted house showing clips from cheesy old horror movies and cracking jokes about it. The thing I really associate with John Zacherly is a movie from 1986 called Brain Damage. Director Frank Henenlotter's follow-up to Basket Case. Zacherly was the voice of the brain parasite Elmer in that.
Oh my god.
Calling all stations. Clear the air lanes. Clear all air lanes for the big broadcast.
And this is one that I actually watched a lot on TV here lately. Svengoolie.
Svengoolie?
Which is something like a local tradition in the Chicago area. It goes back to 1970. The show was first called Screaming Yellow Theater and hosted by a guy called Jerry Bishop, in character as Svengoolie. Black around his eyes and some white on his face, and he's got a Fu Manchu and a hat. Cracks cheesy jokes, but that's not the version of Svengoolie that people really know. 79, a guy named Rich Kaz took over for Jerry Bishop and started doing Son of Svengoolie. And that ran from 79 to 86. At some point before Jerry Bishop died, he said, said to Rich Kaz, you don't have to be son of Svengoolie anymore. You can just be Svengoolie. You own the character at this point. And the reason I bring this up, Svengoolie is now nationally syndicated on MeTV. In our area, it's up in the 200s. Pretty obscure network, but they just show old TV shows from the 50s and 60s and 70s. Their Saturday night block, it's Star Trek, Wonder Woman, Batman, and then Svengoolie. So it's a pretty good block for people who like old, weird stuff. Did you get a chance to watch Svengoolie? I told you to watch it. Usually work on Saturday nights. Sorry. Opens up, it's him in a coffin. The coffin opens up. He tells a bunch of cheesy jokes. They throw rubber chickens. He'll insert himself into the movies sometimes. They'll sing songs about it.
Yeah.
It's really cheesy, but it's fun. And the cool thing about the current Svengoolie program, which has been running since 1994, by the way, they have made some sort of deal with Universal Studios, so they actually have the rights to show Frankenstein and Dracula and the sequels. So it's not just the same 6 public domain movies like a lot of these horror host programs.
Right.
Greetings, I'm Count Gore Devon, and in the world of genetic engineering, you know what you would get if you crossed a werewolf and a vampire? A fur collar that would fasten itself to your neck.
And hey, here's one that we've met. Well, I've met him twice, and you've met him once, briefly.
Right.
And that's Count Gore Duvall. And this is our local horror host here in the D.C. area. He first started doing this in 1973 with a show called Creature Feature. Dick Dazelle is the guy's real name. And he was also Bozo the Clown in the D.C. area. In the afternoons after school, he was Captain 20, who would show Ultraman and Speed Racer and stuff like that. And he had Vulcan ears and a page boy wig he put on. The character he's really well known for is Count Gore, who is a cheesy vampire who tells these really lame jokes and hangs out in this cardboard crypt set. The original Creature Feature ran from 73 to 80. They brought it back in 84 and it ran until 87. And then in 1998, he started doing Creature Feature on the internet. On his website and on his Wikipedia entry, which I bet he wrote, he talks about how he was the first online horror host. First guy to do this on the internet. And I can't imagine trying to watch a movie on the internet in 1998.
Back in 1998.
Did anything resembling high-speed internet as we know it today exist back then?
I remember when you could download a movie in 4 hours.
And that was a good speed.
And that was awesome.
I remember I tried to download this 5-minute short film that a friend of mine had made. It took me a couple tries, and I think it took me 4 hours altogether before I finally was able to download the damn thing. Count Gore, I've met him twice now. I met him at our local Alamo Draft House because they made a movie about his life. It's called Every Other Day is Halloween. They also talk a bit about the revival of interest in horror hosting. Mr. Lobo's in it briefly. After the movie, not very many people had shown up for the screening, and he was there in person. And I talked to him for like a half an hour afterwards because nobody else was there to talk to the guy. And we had this really great conversation about the whole horror host thing and how long he'd been doing it. I met the guy the next year at Horrifying, and I believe if you go back to episode 9 of the Bangers and Mash show, you can hear us talking about Horrifying, which was a really cool convention in Gettysburg that unfortunately is defunct now. He was there as well, and I went up to him, and he didn't remember me. I felt personally slighted by Count Gore Duvall that he did not remember meeting me.
Okay, but he meets...
Yeah, but we talked for a half an hour. I figured he would at least remember me, but he didn't. It's cool. He's a nice guy. I debated including this next one on our list here. Figure, when else are we going to talk about this thing? Fits the horror host thing to a degree, though it put a spin on it that nobody else had really done before. And that's Mystery Science Theater 3000. Now, were you a fan of MST3K?
When it was on, I wasn't.
You weren't one of those assholes who would watch the movie and go, why are they talking over it?
No. The couple of times that I caught it on, they weren't movies that interested me.
Yeah,
so
the films were frequently terrible.
I couldn't get into them. They wouldn't just show sci-fi.
No, and that's something else we should have talked about when we were talking about Joe Bob. Joe Bob just didn't show monster movies. Even MonsterVision didn't just show monster movies. I remember seeing Highlander and some of the Star Trek movies on MonsterVision at least once. Mystery Science Theater, I think it's a huge cult hit. Maybe more popular now than it's ever been.
People that were 6 years old, like I was when this show was on.
Yeah.
They've grown up, nostalgia's hit them, and they're trying to
it's all
rediscover the show.
Yeah, and it's all over YouTube. You can find a lot of episodes on YouTube, and a lot of episodes have been released on home video. Shout Factory is up to volume 30 of their Mystery Science Theater collections. The show's had a long run. It started in the Midwest on a local station called KTMA, and that ran from 88 till 89. Then they moved to Comedy Central, which was still called the Comedy Channel at the time. They ran there from 89 to 1996. When I got into the show, it was on the Sci-Fi Channel, where it ran from 97 to 99, and then ran in reruns for years afterwards. Guy on a spaceship being forced to watch bad movies, and his lone companions are 2 robots he's built. Well, there are 4 robots, but only 2 of them are important. Tom Servo, Pro T Robot. The gimmick that this brings to the horror host format is that they just don't show the shitty movies. They make fun of it.
Right, they sit there and they comment on it.
And sometimes it makes the movie more watchable. I can't imagine watching Manos Hands of Fate without the assistance of Joel and the bot.
Right, and then other ones that just, shut up, I want to watch the movie.
You know, usually the films were bad. When they first moved to Sci-Fi, they showed a couple Universal Monster movies. The first time I saw Revenge of the Creature was on Mystery Science Theater. Every once in a while they would show something that wasn't too bad, but usually the movies were not good. Though sometimes they were charming in their badness. The Final Sacrifice, which is a Canadian movie about a character named Zap Rousdower.
Okay.
There were 2 hosts. There was Joel and then Mike. And apparently in the early days of the internet and in the Usenet days, there were intense fandom wars over who was better, Joel or Mike. It was more intense than Kirk versus Picard. Kirk. Anyway, I like both. I like Joel and Mike, but I think because Mike was the one I really first experienced, I tend to like him a little better. He was a little more sarcastic, while Joel was a little goofier, making inventions and stuff. And anyway, I love MST3K. It's the ultimate comfort food for me. It's something that I put on, and it always makes me chuckle. I didn't know if we should talk about this guy.
I think he's more appropriate than
MST because he actually talks about horror.
Yeah.
But it's not really a horror host because he's not talking about pre-existing movies.
But he's still hosting horror.
It's the Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt.
Tales from the Crypt. By the way, you better keep that Tales from the Crypt recorded. I think that was the best one I've ever done.
I don't really want to talk about Tales from the Crypt, the show, too much. I want to do an episode about horror television shows.
Well, right, but if we wouldn't have mentioned it, people would have gone in. I'm angrily typing on the keys.
We don't get very much negative feedback. We don't get very much feedback, period. But I want to talk about the Crypt Keeper as like a pop culture icon. It was huge there for a while.
My God, there's a Tales from the Crypt Christmas album.
Yeah, there was.
And I own it.
There was no way we were getting out of here without talking about, I believe it is called Have Yourself a Scary Little Christmas.
That is the name of it.
We've actually played some music from that CD on our Christmas episodes. Tales from the Crypt ran on HBO from 1989 to 1996. And I remember for a while anyway, this was the reason to get HBO. People would get HBO just to watch Tales from the Crypt. I own all of it over there.
I don't own it. I need to buy it.
It's pretty cheap. You can get season double packs for $20 on Amazon, man. You've got no excuse.
You're right. You're right. You're right.
The Crypt Keeper Halloween decoration was something of a cottage industry. You still can find some merchandise. It's softened a bit. Though I bet the nostalgia revival of that has got to be coming soon.
We need to have a Crypt Keeper movie.
So what are you talking about, man? There were 3 movies.
No. A Crypt Keeper movie.
Of just the adventures of the Crypt Keeper?
Yeah.
There was a Saturday morning cartoon show. We want to talk about Tales from the Crypt Keeper?
No. I want to talk about Tales from the Crypt Keeper.
We've actually talked about this a lot. The weird phenomenon of R-rated movies being turned into children's cartoon. And this wasn't an R-rated movie, but because Tales from the Crypt was on HBO, there was lots of nudity and lots of violence.
Blood, sex, violence.
You remember for a time, they would show Tales from the Crypt on Fox, edit it for content.
Yeah.
I remember seeing...
What's the point?
I didn't have HBO as a kid. That was the way I saw the show. They would show Tales from the Crypt on Friday nights for a while. What's the style of the Crypt Keeper?
He's a puppet.
Yes, he is a
puppet. Well,
puppet.
you know, his style is a little dead.
His jokes are rotten.
Not lively at all.
The puns, man. The motherfucking puns. It shouldn't be funny when in the show somebody gets murdered with the axe and the Crypt Keeper says, I bet he axed him a question. For some reason, you laugh. Because it's a fucking puppet in a crypt doing it, you laugh. And let's talk about the opening to that show. One of the greatest...
The amazing jaunting tuba.
Yeah, the Danny Elfman theme music. The camera's going for a graveyard, up onto a mansion on top of a spooky hill. That opening is Halloween distilled. The character was popular enough. There was a fucking cartoon show, Tales from the Crypt Keeper, which ran from 93 to 94. I believe it was on CBS. And then they revived it for a year in 1997 as the new Tales from the Crypt Keeper. Now, I don't remember that one, but apparently they had morals tagged on to the end of the episode.
I don't remember that.
On one level, it seems lame. Who wants a heavy-handed preachiness with a horror cartoon? But at the same time, that almost fits in with Tales from the Crypt. Those stories are always kind of morality plays. It's usually about somebody cheating on their spouse, or somebody trying to steal some money from somebody. It's always about bad people getting their comeuppance. There was even a fucking kids' game show. Do you remember Secret from the Crypt Keeper's Haunted House?
Oh, I think I do remember that.
Yeah, it was these kids kids on a green screen running on a treadmill. On the show, you would see a giant CGI skull shooting, they'd call them fireballs or basketballs, at these kids on a platform. But in reality, I bet those kids were on a green screen, on a stage, and some stagehand wrapped in a green suit was throwing dodgeballs at them. And that ran from 96 to 97, but I have very vivid memories of that show. I definitely remember seeing it. I remember the final round where they had to run through the haunted house and grab the skulls off the walls, and it's just...
Now, did John Kassir do the voice?
Absolutely. John Kassir, whom we've met. He's always voiced the modern iteration of the Crypt Keeper and everything. The same way that Elvira was a spokesperson for just different products and would show up in commercials and things, the Crypt Keeper was that same way. I remember at least twice he was hosting a movie on network TV. Do you remember the sitcom with Joey Lawrence called Brotherly Love? Anyway, there was an episode that had the Crypt Keeper on it. And I remember the opening where the littlest Lawrence brother, whose name I can't remember, turned on the TV and it was the Crypt Keeper. And he said, "Is that you, Crypt Keeper?" And the Crypt Keeper said, "No, it's Fran Drescher." Of course, there were movies. There were 3 movies. Demon Knight from 95, Bordello of Blood from 96, and then Rituals from 2001, which went direct to video. Do we like those Tales from the Crypt movies?
I like Demon Knight.
Billy Zane's in that, right?
Yes.
Mr. William Zane. I remember not being real crazy about that one, but maybe I should revisit it. I don't think I've ever seen Bordello of Blood or Rituals. I know Tim Curry's in one of those.
Must be Rituals.
I remember seeing the poster for Demon Knight in my local video rental shop for years. The Crypt Keeper with sunglasses on, I believe. That's a stupid thing we have a lot of dumb affection for.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another installment of USA Up All Night with me, Rhonda.
Remember the USA Network? It's still around.
Yeah.
What does the USA Network show these days? Like,
I don't know.
Law and Order reruns, usually.
Man, it used to be the weekend on USA was the best thing ever because they would show nothing but horror movies all weekend long.
Again, low-budget cable channels don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of programming. They fill the hours with monster movies. And USA had a bunch of different, I guess you'd call them horror host programs. But there are a few I do occasionally recall. First one, thing they did from 1985 to 1989, called Commander USA's Groovy Movies. Commander USA was a washed-up superhero. He looked like, sort of like what you would imagine a creepy uncle that maybe has an alcohol problem.
Okay.
And he was wearing, they looked like pajamas, a washed-up superhero who had a secret base underneath of a strip mall in New Jersey. He would show movies, not always horror movies, but usually. I found a YouTube clip of him hosting a Friday the 13th marathon, to give you an idea of the sort of thing he would show. That one I don't remember very well, but one I do remember seeing. And I guess we really shouldn't talk about it, because this one didn't have a host, but it was called USA Saturday Nightmares. And this was on what night of the week?
Saturday. Saturday.
That ran from 1986 to 1994. And what I remember about Saturday Nightmares is that it opened with a camera going into an old house, and then it would go into a CGI tour of a hallway where there were different famous horror characters on the walls. Frankenstein and Freddy Krueger and the girl from Poltergeist. And then it would dead end in this theater where the Saturday Nightmares logo would come up. And they didn't just show movies, they also showed the Alfred Hitchcock Hour and a show called The Hitchhiker. I don't know if you remember The Hitchhiker. That was kind of a horror anthology show. That's how I first saw Waxwork, was on Saturday Nightmares.
I don't remember this one at all.
Do you remember Up All Night?
No.
Okay. Up All Night ran from 89 until 1998. And there were 2 versions of Up All Night. There was the Saturday night version and the Friday night version. And the Saturday night version was hosted by Gilbert Gottfried. Now, we all know who he is, right? This very abrasive stand-up comedian. He has a great podcast called Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal Podcast. But it's on Fridays. From 94 to 98, Up All Night was hosted by Rhonda Shear, who was doing kind of an Elvira thing. Rhonda Shear, very attractive woman, usually hosted in a negligee, low-cut thing.
She wore exercise gear one time.
Yeah. Her trademark, she would say, "Up All Night." I mentioned the late night masturbators, and I think
yes,
that show really catered to that audience. They would show horror movies pretty frequently, but they would also show sexploitation movies. I remember Virgin Academy or something like that was one they showed once. Edit it for content, which seems to defeat the purpose.
I guess.
Well, a movie we talked about on our dinosaur episode, Tammy and the T-Rex, that was one I saw on Up All Night. But I do remember seeing a 967 Evil. Is that the name of that movie with Stephen Jeffries? Evil Ed from Friday Night?
I thought it was 976 Evil.
976 Evil. Okay, that was one I saw on Up All Night. I was pretty young when this show was on. I didn't watch it regularly. The sex aspect went right over my head. The USA Network used to be way weirder.
Welcome to AMC EFX. I'm Stan Winston.
One I mentioned a little earlier, and one I remember very well. The show was hugely influential on me. The disappointing part is there's very little evidence of its existence, but I assure you it was real. We mentioned AMC. And what's AMC famous for now?
Walking Dead.
Walking Dead, Breaking Bad, Mad Men. AMC used to be American movie classics. Now, they're very well known for their prestige dramas. I guess you'd call Walking Dead a prestige drama.
Let me rant about that for a minute.
Sure.
If you're not going to stick with your fucking shtick, don't do it. MTV, music television. Do you ever see fucking music on MTV? No.
It's an old
They're like reality show, the channel. Fucking
TLC?
TLC?
The Learning Channel?
The Learning Channel? What the fuck do you learn on there? How to be a toothless redneck?
I think you learn from their mistakes.
Oh, shots fired. AMC, American Movie Classics.
They don't show movies or classics.
Well, they do, but they show them at weird hours. Ooh, it used to be periodically throughout a day. You could turn on AMC. They'd probably be showing some kind of movie that'd be worth watching. That's where I saw most of the original Tarzan movies, was on AMC.
Okay.
Was it Weissmiller?
Yeah, Johnny Weissmiller is the real famous Tarzan.
When he dives into the water, they fast forward it, so it looks like it's swimming really fast.
Yeah, those movies are a ball.
They never show them anymore.
No, they don't show old movies. When they show movies, they're new stuff. Network decay is something we've ranted about before, and it really bothers us a lot. In the late 90s, early 2000s, AMC, back when they were still American Movie Classics, they showed old movies, showed them commercial-free, showed them uncut. That is where I saw the original Universal monster movies. And the reason we're talking about this is on Friday nights, they had a programming block called EFX, and it was hosted by Stan Winston, Academy Award-winning special effects artist Stan Winston. We've talked about his work many times on this show. We admire him. And it wasn't quite like a horror host thing. He didn't tell silly jokes. There were no skits. He was always wearing a black t-shirt, and he was sitting in a chair, the room full of all the monsters and special effects he had created over the years. I remember seeing the penguins from Batman Returns and the Kogafa from The Relic on there a lot. Oh, and the monsters from the Monster Squad. Those were always prominently displayed.
Especially the Go-Man. And the Predator was displayed there, too.
Yeah, and the Terminator, very famous things he's worked on. Well, The Relic isn't that famous. He would talk a little bit about the movie, he'd give some trivia, and it was always really interesting to me. And I remember I started watching EFX because they would occasionally show a Godzilla movie, and I was really into Godzilla at the time. And I was hoping if I could...
At the time?
Well, yeah. I started watching it with the hope that I would see the ones I hadn't seen. And instead I started seeing some of the old Universal Monster movies and fell in love with those. And that was a great show, and unfortunately, there's very little information about it. I couldn't even find any information on when it ran. The way I found out that it ran from 99 to 2002, found a website that keeps track of copyrights and showed that AMC first registered the copyright for the show title EFX in 99 and it expired in 2002. There's one clip of the show on YouTube of Stan Winston talking about Rodan. So it's very disappointing that there's not more information about this out there because it had a huge influence on me. This was the horror host thing that I related to the most. We'll talk about this a little bit. We'll talk about Monsterfest. In October, they would show horror movies, man, all month. It used to be classic monsters.
Yes.
It's not even Monsterfest, now it's Horror Fest.
Back in the days of Monsterfest, it was really cool. All month long, they would show nothing but old black and white classic movies.
Usually, yeah. The very first Monsterfest I watched, Whoopi Goldberg was the host that year. Because apparently Whoopi Goldberg's a huge horror fan. Have we talked about this before? We might have. Fans, if you're listening, tell us if we're repeating ourselves. There were segments where a guy in a morgue monologuing to the camera. That was where I first saw Gamera. Thinking that was 99?
However, when I started watching Monsterfest...
Was it the year with John Carpenter? That was the first year you watched?
Might have been.
Where they did the short streamers, the little 1 minute long short films. It was our freshman year of high school. The year they did John Carpenter.
Almost the whole month, it was classic Universal Monster movies.
The first time I remember seeing a newer movie on Monsterfest, they showed the Omen movies one year.
Halloween Day was always Halloween.
Yeah, it eventually became that. But
no, it's always been
No,
that.
it hasn't always been that.
All right.
I'm telling you.
I'm always wrong, you're always right.
Well, I'm glad you're realizing this, Mr. Mash.
Open your mind to the possibility that they're not bad movies, just misunderstood. You're not dreaming. You're watching cinema. Insomnia.
Somebody we've met twice now. No, 3 times. Thrice. We've met Mr. Lobo.
Has seen us so many times that he is starting to remember us.
Yeah!
Could be a good thing or a bad thing.
It's probably not a good thing. Mr. Lobo is horror hosting the classic mold. Wears a suit, and he has a cheesy wig.
I don't think that's a wig.
You think that's his actual hair?
I think that's his actual hair.
Mr. Lobo hosts a show called Cinema Insomnia. And I remember first hearing about him on an internet forum for a website called scifilm.org. Now, that address still exists. If you go there now, it's the reviews of Dan Schneider. But it used to be this wonderful website for classic horror, sci-fi, fantasy movie reviews. And they had a wonderful forum. In that forum, the website has been gone for many years. But I remember people started talking about the show called Cinema Insomnia, which was a horror host show and very much in the classic vein, where they would show cheesy, low-budget movies, usually public domain movies. Mr. Lobo, the host, would come on and do silly skits and fake commercials. Cinema Insomnia has been running in some form almost continuously since 2001.
Yeah.
Now it's on Roku. He does a lot of conventions and things at local theaters. Now, this guy is not from the East Coast, where we are. He's been showing up in our area a lot here over the last couple years.
I'm wondering if he's recently moved here.
Maybe. I think he travels a lot. I think he makes most of his money not from Cinema Insomnia, but from hosting events. This is a good time to talk about this. 2 or 3 weeks ago, again at our local Alamo Draft House, which is the coolest place to see a movie in our podunk part of the country, Mr. Lobo showed up and hosted Creature from the Black Lagoon on the big screen in 3D. And that was a ball.
Which we learned that Creature from the Black Lagoon was shot in polarized 3D.
Yeah, that's what Mr. Lobo said.
Which is the actual 3D technology that they use today.
What's Mr. Lobo's catchphrase? They're not bad movies.
They're just misunderstood.
They're just misunderstood.
Although I challenge him on that.
Depends on the movie. Last Halloween, he hosted an all-night horror fest called Dismember the Alamo. He showed, what was it? Night of the Creeps,
Night of the Comet.
I believe it was Night of the Creeps, Halloween 3, Monster Squad, Night of the Comet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you wanted to do it in order.
But that was a lot of fun, and we actually stayed for all 4 movies.
Yes.
By the time Night of the Comet started, there were 6 people in the theater, maybe.
We rocked it out to the end.
Yeah, it was 4 in the morning by the time we got home. It was late. The thing that made me feel cheated is Mr. Lobo, he left before Night of the Comet started. He chickened out.
Yeah, he did.
And then we met him once before at Monster Bash last summer.
Welcome to William Shatner's Full Moon Fright. Perfect place to lose your mind watching a horror flick.
Well, do you remember this? This was on Sci-Fi Channel. It ran in 2002, and it was called Full Moon Fright Night. It was all full moon movies, and it was hosted by Mr. William Shatner. You don't remember this?
I remember it. Nobody cares.
It seems right up your alley, though.
This is a full moon style show, and I'm going to talk about full moon movies.
He doesn't talk like that. This is when I first saw Castle Freak.
Mama just killed a man. Put a gun against his head.
That should be the outro music for this
Pulled
episode.
my trigger. Now he's
dead.
Rocket Man!
Rocket Man! For Full Moon Fright Night, William Shatner dressed up like a vampire. He had a sidekick, creature-looking thing. Just didn't show the movie. He would also interview people. I remember when he showed Castle Freak, he interviewed Jeffrey Combs. I remember Stan Lee was on Full Moon Fright Night once. But it was short-lived. It only ran for a year.
It's because that's all the good full moon movies there were.
I don't know if they showed any of the Puppet Master movies.
I'm Rob Zombie. This is TCM Underground.
I upgraded to Cable Plus for 2 programs, the first of which was on Turner Classic Movies. It used to air on Friday nights, now it airs on Saturday nights, called TCM Underground. And they show cult movies. They show old horror movies, biker movies. Sometimes they show newer stuff. They showed Evil Dead at one point. They've shown some Dario Argento films. Last time I watched it, they showed Bob Clark's Deaf Dream, aka Dead of Night. Originally, when TCM Underground first started, it was hosted by Rob Zombie. That got a big push in Fangoria magazine. I read an article where Rob Zombie talked about his approach. He didn't want to do the cheesy horror host thing. He was doing what you'll see on primetime on Turner Classic Movies, where Robert Osborne comes in and talks about the film in a very interesting but stately manner. Rob Zombie was doing something similar. Unfortunately, he's not associated with the show anymore, but they still have special interviews with people from the film sometimes. Good way to see some weird stuff. The great thing about Turner Classic Movies is that they always show very interesting things. They never just show the same stuff. And around the same time, the IFC, Independent Film Channel, back when they were still the Independent Film Channel, they had a thing called IFC Grindhouse, and they would show exploitation-style movies. I remember seeing Bubba Hotep on there and Phantasm. And that was hosted by a guy in a suit, and he would say, the film you are about to see is shocking, terrifying, repugnant to moral values. They were making fun of that kind of mindset. So that was cool, and that's long gone.
Way back in 1963, Ernie Anderson began the madcap comedy on TV8 when he invented a character called Ghoulardi.
Got a list here of some horror host things. A lot of these I've never seen, know nothing about. Like
Chilly Billy.
Chilly Billy, who hosted Chiller Theater in Pittsburgh from 1963 to 1983. We haven't met Chilly Billy, but we were in a room with him.
Yes.
Chilly Billy is famous. He's in Night of the Living Dead, one of the news reporters.
Right.
And he's listed in the credits as Chilly Billy, considered one of the most influential horror hosts. Ghoulardi, based out of Cleveland, from 63 to 66. And Ghoulardi's famous for 2 things. First off, he's the father of director Paul Thomas Anderson, director of Magnolia. And also because he was the first guy to insert himself into the movie.
Do you like the pop-up video thing?
Yeah, I'm in there.
Oh god, now the viewers listening to this show, they just had a mad rush of
nostalgia for pop-up video. What's worse is the people listening to this who don't remember pop-up video, JD.
Shut up and finish the podcast.
There was the Ghoul, who was based out of Cleveland and Detroit. Here's one that sounds familiar to me, but I don't know if I ever saw this. Aired on Fox for a while. Big Chuck and Little John, big tall guy and a short person, I believe is the politically correct term. They were on Fox in the early 90s, but they predate that. And I never saw them, but I feel like I had lots of opportunities to. I don't know how I missed these guys. And then here's one, I don't know if this counts. On the show SCTV, which was kind of like the Canadian Saturday Night Live, they had a recurring gag called Count Floyd, played by the actor Joe Flaherty. The gag is that Count Floyd would show movies that were not scary, and he would try and make them scary with over-exaggeration. You remember the show on Cartoon Network, Cartoon Planet?
Yeah.
It was a spin-off of Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Occasionally they would show clips of Count Floyd on that show. I don't know why. Hey, here's one that's cool. Grandpa Munster, Al Lewis, would host something something occasionally called Super Scary Saturdays on TBS from 86 to 88.
Super Scary Saturdays.
Obviously, this was before our time. I wish I could have seen that. That would have been so cool. I guess that's why in Gremlins 2, they have a guy that's like Grandpa Munster. And then here's one that's local. Monster Madhouse. It's hosted by a character called Carlos Borloff. I would describe as a cross between Macho Man Savage and Beetlejuice. He hosts the show called Monster Madhouse. And I've met this guy a couple of times. I would describe the show as Pee-wee's Playhouse on acid.
Yeah, that's fair. What about Phantom of the Opry?
Yeah, talk about Phantom of the Opry. He's based out of Nashville, I'm assuming.
Right, this is an older one, around the time of Elvira and all that.
Okay, so the 80s.
He walked like a hunchback, and he talked like the ghouls.
Quasi-Boris Karloff thing. This sounds like your typical horror host.
It was fine. Same kind of thing.
Do you remember the White Zombie, I'm Your Boogeyman music video? They have like a horror host thing in that. Dr. Spooky, I believe, was the name of that character.
Living Dead Girl had a horror host thing.
Yeah, Rob Zombie's, that's a motif he's revisited a few times. More modern horror host is called Mr. Sarcophagi.
Ivana Cadaver.
Ivana Cadaver, oh boy.
But she gets points just for the name.
Until next time, unpleasant dreams.
This was a pretty silly episode, talking about a pretty silly subject.
Sarah.
Before we wrap up our own spooky super show here, you can email us at bangersandmash88@yahoo.com. That's the word bangers, that's the letter N, that's the word mash, it's the number 88@yahoo.com. You can find us on Facebook, www.facebook.com/thebangersandmashshow. Thank you, Lehman, for the nice message. And any other listeners who want to respond to the show, please do, as always. We're getting closer to Halloween, man. August is getting close to being over at this point.
I know. I've already started watching horror movies. I'm not gonna lie.
Me too.
I think every year I started earlier and earlier.
Just earlier today, we were in a craft store geeking out about all the Halloween decorations.
That's who we are.
And the show will be getting spookier the closer we get to October. We know we haven't been talking about a lot of strictly, explicitly horror stuff over the summer. Terminator and Predator and Alien, things that have horror elements but aren't full-blown horror. And we're going to be getting back to that in the next couple months. We have some good things planned. Unpleasant dreams.
Good night. And don't let the bed bugs bite.
Yeah, seriously, don't. Have a spooky evening.
And watch out for the
hooligans.
You know, a lot of people write me and say, hey, Joe Bob Briggs, just what is MonsterVision? You don't need no special glasses or an insect's head. Just a healthy love for slime and disrespect for the dead. We'll talk about some movies by the old double wide. And when you get that creepy feeling creeping up inside, well then you got MonsterVision, it's a heck of a fright. We're tearing the heart out of Saturday night. These MonsterVision movies serve a primitive drive. 'Cause watching people die can make you feel so alive. So throw away your clicker now, the flicks of a gun. 'Cause there's nothing you can do while fully dressed that's as fun as watching ENT beneath the bug zapper light.